we'll resolve any topic conflict issues. I'll take a look at the list. If you have any questions, I'm very happy to help kind of move in that direction. Just kind of preliminarily make sure we don't have 20 people talking about the P-51 Mustang. So we'll start it over here. If you are signing up for a duplicate, I'm not trying to alienate this other. Just write it down, and we'll settle those duplicate topics over the next week. So. Any questions about those projects? It'll be the last 2 weeks of class before the final. So we'll basically finish up here in about, I think, over the next 3 weeks with actual new material. And then we'll do 2 weeks of presentations, so, as well as the exam review.
Oh, sure, yeah.
Alrighty, so last week we talked about the overall Allied strategy for World War II. Just for everybody's, for the sake of everybody here, anybody kind of remember big picture, you know, how we were going to fight the Allies? The Axis. Very good. Brain's a little fuzzy this morning.
Huge formations of heavy bombers.
Okay.
Everywhere.
Okay, but primarily where? Okay, so the European theater. What was our kind of going into the war strategy for Japan?
We were gonna cut off their oil and gas supply to kind of like starve their infrastructure systems.
Okay. Were we kind of going on the offensive right away, or just kind of defensive initially? Okay, very good. So defensive initially. Kind of Great Britain and the United States got together and decided kind of Europe first, while kind of in a sense, I don't want to use Cold War terminology, but kind of containing Japan in the Pacific. So, you know, kind of the first major fighting we found ourselves encountering in World War II was where? Okay, North Africa. What lessons learned did we see there with our use of air power? Okay. That's kind of more for mainland Europe.
Flying the close air support wasn't necessarily the best idea. We needed to establish their superiority before we could really do anything else. Otherwise, our planes would get picked apart.
Okay, so air superiority is important.
That, like aircraft should be led by airmen, not by the army.
Okay, because how had we been assigning aircraft prior to?
Like army units,
Okay. Yep. So just basically to Army ground commanders, they designate, hey, these aircraft are kind of assigned to you. Use them as you see fit. Where essentially those ground commanders were commanding those air units as well. We all know that airmen best command air units, and maintenance officers best command maintenance units. And Lieutenant Colonel Gore's best command ROTC units. Tied it all together. All right. Okay, so we kind of got talking about strategic bombing in Europe. Kind of as far as we gotten last week, how was it going? Really well or poorly? Okay, with examples of failed attacks on which sites? Okay, so Schweinfurt, what were the Germans producing there? Ball bearings. Okay, ball bearings, huge Allied losses there. And Ploesti, anybody remember what? Oil. Okay, very good. So kind of some of those key targets that we had outlined in the interwar years in our war plans. Things weren't panning out. We're losing a lot of bombers. We kind of identified a couple key reasons: no long-range support, as well as just attacking. During the day, we were exposed to anti-aircraft artillery as well. Okay, so kind of throughout the latter part of 1943, after these failed raids, we basically kind of stopped bombing heavily until we had proper fighter escorts. So we outfitted P-47s with external fuel tanks, and what was the latest, greatest fighter aircraft we had come on board? Okay, so P-51 Mustang, the one that so many of you are probably going to try to talk about for your air power project. Cohen called it. Everybody called it. Okay. So kind of as we did start incorporating fighter escorts, obviously we saw immediate impact. So as we had these new long-range fighters arrive in the theater in force, they began to roam all of occupied Europe looking for opportunities to fight, and the Germans continued to lose both experienced pilots and as well as aircraft. And as we were gaining air superiority, we went so far as to our fighters were actually attacking German aircraft on the ground, so they weren't even getting airborne. Additionally, the 8th Air Force resumed raids deep into Germany in early February of 1944. By the end of that month, we were able to wage 1,000 plane raids, and for the first time, the U.S. bombers attacked Berlin, so the capital. March 1944, all the way through VE Day in Europe. Anybody remember when victory over Europe occurred? Favorites? Come on, German minor, major. Okay.
I don't really like that.
Okay. We'll leave that one alone. So basically, though, it was approximately about a year and a month or so that we were able to basically continuously bombard targets deep into Germany. So started bombing targets deep into Germany, such as Berlin in February '44. We had achieved air superiority by that spring, so just basically within a couple months. We were still prone to anti-aircraft fire, still took a slight toll on our bombers, but losses from German fighter aircraft plummeted. And at this time, you see that last bullet up there, it's kind of when we really kind of started tightening the noose on Germany. German oil production declined from May of 1944 through the end of the war. Bomb plants both in Germany and at Ploesti, basically all the way up until August 1944. By the following month, in September 1944, so still almost with a year left in the war, German oil production was only about 25% of full capacity. Really, kind of those last 6 months till the last year of the war, literally the German forces left were actually kind of out trying to steal oil from the Allies in the occupied areas. Any questions so far? Okay, so just kind of remember these are kind of lessons learned well after the war. No two wars are going to be the same. We did have several lessons learned in the European theater. Despite kind of us putting good target lists out going into the war with AWPD-1 and the various revisions of that plan, we didn't examine the target list to meet the needs of the bombing campaign for Europe. A study after the war discovered that the best targets would have primarily been the oil industry, the POL production, and electrical systems. Talked about it last week, how we attacked submarine pens, and those were kind of wasted targets, wasted attacks. And the ball bearing plant bombing raids additionally were not as effective. So while we were doing this high altitude daylight strategic bombing, who was attacking at night?
Brits.
Okay, the Brits. They kind of focused their attacks more on civilian centers, kind of with the thought of terror bombing, so kind of bomb the enemy into submission. That really didn't work either, so it's kind of another lesson learned, was at least in this conflict against that enemy, that was not enough to force Germany to surrender. And of course, kind of the biggest lesson learned that we've already talked about, bombers would need fighter escorts to and from targets to minimize bomber losses. Any questions where we're at right now? Okay, so now that we've kind of talked quite a bit about Europe, we're going to shift gears to the Pacific theater in World War II. And we'll start off with an outstanding quote. Who would like to be General Spaatz?
In our victory over Japan, air power was unquestionably decisive. That the planned invasion of Japanese home islands was unnecessary is clear evidence that air power has evolved into a force co-equal with land and sea power, decisive in its own rights, and worthy of the faith of its prophets.
All right, very good. So, General Spaatz, later Chief of Staff of the Air Force, talking about how decisive air power was in the victory over Japan. So we're going to talk first kind of Japanese objectives in the Pacific, primarily against the United States. So the Japanese felt territorial expansion was necessary due to overcrowding on the home island and the need for raw materials to industrialize. Bless you. Japan had joined the Alliance of the Axis Powers in 1936 and signed the Tripartite Treaty in 1940. Basically, that was more of the military alliance portion of their alliance. When Germany defeated France and Holland, a power vacuum emerged in the Southwest Pacific. So, anybody know what colonies France had, primarily in Asia? Okay. Okay. So, what was that? Okay. So primarily French. It was called French Indochina. So Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, that area. Anybody know what Holland or Netherlands, where they held territory? Okay, kind of it all in that area. They all kind of have different names. But they called them the Dutch East Indies, I believe. At this point in time, Britain was too busy to protect most of its interests in the area, and Japan kind of moved in to fill the power vacuum. We talked about it last week, kind of the with Japan's expansion primarily into Manchuria, a portion of China, as well as other portions of the Pacific. The U.S. imposed sanctions on Japan, and that kind of really pushed Japan into looking further east at U.S. assets, as well as U.S. Mainland. So when the Japanese chose to attack Pearl Harbor, it was thought that this would keep the United States out of the war in the Pacific for a period of between 18 months and 2 years. Thought that would give Japan time to kind of solidify in East Asia, and then kind of be better posture either to fight the United States, or they thought the United States just kind of wouldn't fight. So they thought this quick military domination would enable them to establish a strong defensive perimeter, and they thought the United States would never totally unite and go on a long offensive to defeat Japan. But they were wrong because they awoke the sleeping giant. Very good. What was that? America. Very good. And they also thought, strike with mobility, surprise, and massing at unexpected times and places. The Japanese hoped to sue for peace and a stronger position. So they kind of thought that they can consolidate so much land and territory that nobody would fight back. For the most part, their plan worked. Did catch us off guard. Did knock out most of our Pacific fleet, except they had kind of two mistakes. First off, they grossly underestimated American resolve and anger after Pearl Harbor attack. They were basically, wrong in thinking that the United States would not kind of come together en masse and avenge the attacks of December 7th. Additionally, instead of consolidating victories and preparing for their planned defensive perimeter, Japanese basically kept on the offensive and lost a couple major battles, namely the Battle of the Coral Sea in May of 1942, and probably a battle you're more familiar with. The major turning point in the Pacific, the Battle of Midway, very good, in June of 1942. And basically from the Battle of Midway on, they were on the defensive, on the retreat for the remainder of World War II. So basically from June 1942 all the way through August of 1945, so over 3 years. Slides are thinking. So before we get to this amazing video, we're going to talk real quick a couple of Japanese weaknesses that we were kind of able to exploit in our campaign against the Japanese. So Japan, obviously in the Pacific, had long supply lines to get oil as well as war materials, products from its home islands to forces in the Pacific. So if an island got cut off, surrounded, basically impossible for the Japanese to resupply those islands. And the Allies, they didn't expect it, but the Allies decided on a three-pronged strategy to cut Japan off from oil as well as their primary occupied territories, which we're going to talk about after this video, which outlines one of our three-pronged attack.
His was not a career of glamorous flight against glorious sunsets. He was the guy who showed the world how to organize and conduct massive airlift operations. In the early days of World War II, he took a chaotic aircraft delivery system and made it into, in effect, the world's largest airline. He tripled the amount of men and materiel the Army Air Corps carried over the hump into China. With nuclear war looming, he kept Berlin alive under Soviet blockade for 11 months, importing by air everything that millions of people needed to survive. And when North Korea invaded the South, he organized and commanded airlift for the Far East forces that prevented an American Dunkirk at the Busan perimeter. Within a 7-year period, he had organized and managed 3 airlifts that changed history. He is Lieutenant General William Tunner, and he is a legend of air power.
Don't act like you don't like it.
If I had to go anywhere, General William Tunner wrote, why of all places did it have to be the hump? The China-Burma-India Theater, as the hump was more formally known, was the closest thing the Allies had to the Germans-Russian front. It was the war's backwater, a hell, or at least purgatory, of jungles and impassable mountains. By keeping the Chinese army supplied and fighting, the over-the-hump flyers were tying up millions of Japanese troops who would otherwise be free to fight elsewhere. Tunner arrived in India in August 1944. He commandeered a C-46 and flew the route himself to see what his men were dealing with every day. For more than 3 hours, 550 miles each way, he and his crew flew over mountains pocked with craters from crashed transports. Tunner, who understood well how critical the hump mission was, brought with him a crack team of managers and engineers. They gathered performance statistics that showed where the problems were, the bases that need extra attention. They established maintenance centers and prepared planes on a kind of assembly line. And they upgraded search and rescue operations to the point where pilots knew that if they went down, they had a fighting chance of surviving. While his officers did all of that, Tunner himself went to work upgrading his command's living conditions. He discovered men who had served their tour but never been rotated out, and despite his desperate need of experienced crewmen, put them on planes headed for home. He looked out at his exhausted pilots, and he cut the number of hours they had to fly a month, which cut the rate of pilot error. He declared war on mosquitoes and had his men strip B-25s and fill them with pesticides to spray from above. Known among his men as Willie the Whip, he was a regular on all 19 bases under his command, setting higher and higher standards for everyone, whether a loadmaster or PX officer. He badgered Washington for supplies and was rewarded with fresh uniforms and toiletries so that his command could shed its disheveled appearance. And then he marched them every Saturday, turning a sorry lot of jungle loafers back into soldiers. The transformation was
We're going to
really
start
amazing.
marching on Saturdays.
One base went from an average of 30 flights a day to 81. In September 1944, Tunner's first full month in India, his planes carried 22,000 tons over the hump. In November, it was 35,000. And by July 1945, it was more than 70,000 tons. To celebrate Armed Forces Day in August, Tunner's command orchestrated one of the most amazing feats in military history. Using C-46s, C-47s, and C-54 aircraft, planes barely larger than a modern commuter airliner, they flew 5,327 tons over the hump, an average rate of one plane load every 72 seconds. Winston Churchill, addressing the House of Commons, said this about Tunner's efforts in China. Certainly no more prodigious example of strength, science, and organization in this class of work has ever been seen or dreamt of.
I know it sounds like that video has got cut off. It's because it did. What does that mean for you all? We get more Tunner coming up later this semester, so I know you're all very relieved for that. So China, Burma, India theater, also known as the Hump. Okay, well, what kind of challenges did it present for the Allies?
It was really like it wasn't very developed, so there's lots of jungles and bugs, like mosquitoes everywhere.
Okay.
Or conditions in general, whether it's at base or flying or just kind of organization wasn't too good.
Okay. So bring in Willie the Whip Tunner. Okay, what kind of changes did you hear him doing?
He kind of cut pilot hours and also rotated out people who were exhausted or shouldn't be there so that they didn't have as many pilot errors.
Yep, very good.
Bug Washington until they sent over somebody to appear for them.
Okay, so properly equipping your guys and gals, and they're going to do the job a lot better. Really kind of focused on quality of life, but also instilled that discipline. So they're marching on Saturday mornings, and, turning them a ragtag crew, or whatever the narrator said, into a fine military outfit. Okay, so that was kind of one of the three prongs of our three-pronged approach in the Pacific. So this was kind of the back door. I think they called it the armpit in the video to the Japanese Empire. Primarily, it was resupplying Chinese troops, hence the use of cargo aircraft. The C-47. Remember seeing about that aircraft. We're going to talk about that aircraft more here in a couple weeks when we talk to the start of the Cold War, Berlin Airlift. That sounds a little familiar to some of you. Obviously, this campaign was usually short on manpower and supplies. However, strategically speaking, it was very important to resupply the Chinese. Anybody catching the video as to why?
Tied up millions of Japanese troops.
Okay, very good. So kind of while they're fighting, this is more or less kind of the western front of this area of responsibility. That kind of kept them from sending men and supplies east, basically, to fight the Americans, as well as the Australians. So the Army Air Force supported this effort by flying supplies over the Himalayas, known as the Hump, and it was a logistics triumph. So this kind of was really where we set the groundwork for kind of what modern day Air Mobility Command is responsible for, getting troops and supplies where they need to go. So logistically speaking, this kind of set the framework for that. So anybody want to be a cargo pilot someday? Maybe. Okay. Well, you can thank Willie the Whip Tunner for his genius. And kind of what better way to kind of figure out the problems and correct some of these problems. They talked about him flying the Hump himself, so you can see kind of firsthand the struggles his men were going through, as well as kind of get that insight as to the best way to fix the problems. We'll talk about him some more, like I said, later this semester. But really kind of came into the Berlin Airlift and fixed our operations there as well. So that was one prong of our strategy. Second prong was the South Pacific Offensive. And that was to be commanded by General Douglas MacArthur. And this was composed of an island hopping campaign by U.S. and Australian forces. So I'll show you a map here in a minute, kind of more where this took place. But the first major battle of this campaign was the Battle of Guadalcanal. So the movie was a little bit before your time, but anybody seen The Thin Red Line? No. Came out the same year as Private Ryan, and way overshadowed. Good movie. Was on Netflix. You might want to check it out. And then, bless you. Plan there was to island hop back towards the Philippines. Because we had actually been expelled from the Philippines by the Japanese. General Douglas MacArthur was actually the commanding general in the Philippines. Basically had to surrender a large force at Bataan for the Bataan Death March. Tens of thousands of Allied soldiers were captured. Most of them actually died either on the forced march or in captivity. But nonetheless, Douglas MacArthur said, what when he left?
I'll be back.
I'll be back. He said it just like Arnold, right? I will return. Yes.
Army ROTC is doing like a recreation of the Bataan Death March, like they're looking for sponsors, I guess. Like they're gonna walk like the same distance
Okay.
somewhere.
Is it a local or?
I think they're like going somewhere for it. Swanson was posting about it.
It's New Mexico.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's something down in Southwest. I know they were kind of doing something every year, like marching in like 100 degree temperature, midday heat. Some realistic training there. Okay, so you have the South Pacific offensive, and then the Central Pacific offensive, and that was commanded by Admiral Nimitz. This was another island hopping campaign, primarily involving Navy with Marine units invading islands, along with some Army units. And this, the first major battle was at Tarawa. And this island hopping campaign continued across the Central Pacific towards the Philippines. Both island campaigns, we did skip several Japanese strongholds. If they didn't have aircraft there, if it was just ground troops, we didn't see the need to conquer every island. If we could cut it off, resupply, basically force the Japanese to surrender or die out. And that happened in several instances. Okay, and here's just kind of a, see it up there, basically through 1942, this is kind of where Japan had kind of pushed. Kind of been thrown around the Manchuria area, just kind of show you where that's at. They also control Korea. Down south here, you kind of see French. This was all kind of Dutch territory, with the exception of the Philippines, which was under U.S. influence prior to the war. So Central Pacific, basically kind of coming across this way through the Marianas Islands, places like Tarawa, Saipan, Guadalcanal, and Guam, and then the South Pacific forces coming through out to the south. and then China, Burma, India, kind of in this area. Okay, so we're going to talk both about tactical air power in the Pacific, as well as some strategic bombing in the Pacific. So tactical, remember that's kind of more where the rubber meets the road, supporting the ground forces. So really, until we got within bombing range of mainland Japan, we had no real need for strategic bombing because we didn't have aircraft like we have today, like the B-2 bomber, even the B-1, B-52, where we could air-to-air refuel halfway around the world. We didn't have those capabilities back then. So literally, you had to have an aircraft able to fly to and from a target, basically on one tank of gas. So we had to conquer several islands to get us in position to bomb mainland Japan. So to support the South Pacific Campaign, the 5th Air Force combined with the 13th Air Force to form what was called the Far East Air Force. Its commander was General George Kenney. Name should sound familiar to you. General George Kenney. Anybody remember?
Is he the one that led the flying hackers?
Nope. But he worked with him previously. Where at?
Oh, Air Force.
Okay, Air Corps Tactical School. So General George Kenney, he was big on teaching attack aviation. Remember, kind of what modern day we would call close air support. And this Far East Air Force used innovative techniques such as parachute fragmentation bombs, as well as phosphorus bombs, to interdict enemy positions, troops, and naval forces. So interdiction, that's cutting off enemy supply lines or reinforcements. The Far East Air Force primarily used fighters and medium bombers, with some heavy bombers, to include B-17s and B-24s. The P-38 Lightning was a huge success in the Pacific. It flew really well in warm weather, so aircraft can be kind of finicky with weather. To help with these attack missions, air superiority had to be won. From 1942 to 1944, there was a lot of bitter air-to-air fighting, but the Army Air Force won air superiority the same way we did in Europe, basically a war of attrition. Basically defeated enough of them until they didn't have any aircraft or pilots left. Okay, now that we talked about tactical air power, we're going to move on to some strategic air power. And of course, what better way than to watch a video to introduce it? Jimmy Doolittle coming up. It was working this morning. Try to get in the browser. Not happy for me, I'm happy for all of you.
He was born in Alameda, California, just before the dawning of the 20th century. His mother raised him while his father left them to chase dreams of gold in Alaska. Within 3 years, they would be rejoined in the frontier town of Nome, where he was forced to write that he was the shortest student in the town's one-room school. But if he never grew very tall, he would rise over the years to the stature of national hero. He would achieve world recognition as the holder of speed records and earn the Medal of Honor. His contributions to aviation revolutionized the industry. His name was Jimmy Doolittle, and he is a legend of air power. Doolittle was selected to devise a plan to carry the war to Japan. His solution was to select 18 Army Air Corps bomber crews and train them in B-25 bombers to do the impossible. Operating in complete secrecy, they trained at England, Florida, learning how to force a fully loaded B-25 airborne in less than 400 feet. In March, the crews flew their bombers cross-country to San Francisco, where they were loaded aboard the aircraft carrier USS Hornet and lashed to its wooden deck. Even then, the crews didn't know where they were going or their specific mission. If they were lucky, the Japanese didn't discover them first. They would strike the first offensive blow against the Empire of Japan. At a point roughly 400 miles from Japan, they would launch their planes off the carrier. For Jimmy Doolittle, there could be just one destination: Tokyo. April 18, 1942. Doolittle's Raiders have enough fuel aboard for an 850-mile round trip. The plan calls for the planes and crews to make their bomb runs, scatter, and then return to a rendezvous point where they can ditch their planes close to the task force and be recovered. But a lookout plane spots a Japanese fishing boat. Has it seen the Hornet and transmitted their position? The order is given to destroy the boat. Doolittle knows their best advantage is surprise, and it's possible they struck quickly enough. But he cannot risk the mission on that guess. Despite being over 800 miles from the target, the extreme range of these planes, he gives the order. There will be no pickup by the Navy now. Now they must make their runs and then push on for China, hoping to land their planes safely, hope to find sympathetic Chinese forces rather than Japanese troops along the coastline, hope to survive until they can regroup and get back. One by one, the B-25 Mitchells run up their engines, wobble forward, and lurch into the air. Doolittle knows the odds, and like so many other times in his career, he knows there are no alternatives. They have a mission, they have their orders, they go. The Japanese are so confident in their security, there is no fighter cover.
Thus, the bombers were virtually unopposed as they flew on the deck. They swept in over the coast on their way to Tokyo. Elements separated at some time to 1,500 feet from the bomb. At 12:15, the attack was opened by Doolittle, who dove in before he unloaded his incendiaries upon the Japanese battle. One after another, they checked off their targets. Tank factory, geoscience docks, railroad yards, steel plant, gunpowder factory.
Surprise is complete. The shock is devastating to the Japanese. Tokyo has been bombed. The lift to American morale is without measure. Doolittle has done it again.
One purpose was to give the folks at home the first good news that we had had in World War II.
Doolittle himself is not pleased. Downed in China, his crews are missing. 2 broke orders and landed in the Soviet Union at Vladivostok. They're taken prisoner and remain in Soviet hands for over a year. Many crash land, are injured. One has a leg amputated. All of the aircraft are lost. On this, his first mission as a combat commander, Doolittle is sure the mission has been a disaster.
He felt it was a failure. It caused them to bring back their fighter units to defend the Japanese islands and change their strategy in the Pacific. And changing their strategy led them to believe that they should capture Midway Island. And in that great battle, they lost. So that could be said that the Tokyo raid by Jimmy Doolittle and his raiders was the beginning of the end.
President Roosevelt awards him the Medal of Honor and promotes him to Brigadier General. Doolittle is astonished. Accepting the medal in the name of his crews, he says to the president, "I will spend the rest of my life trying to earn this medal." At an AFA dinner held at the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum, President Ronald Reagan paid this tribute to Jimmy Doolittle.
Will you join me in a toast to a magnificent American, a man whose name will be remembered as long as the virtues of valor and patriotism last? Jimmy Doolittle.
And in June 1985, President Reagan awarded Doolittle his 4th star. Jimmy Doolittle died on September 27, 1993, and was buried at Arlington National Cemetery. 2 years later, the Air Force Association dedicated this statue of him in the lobby of the association's headquarters.
The statue of General James H. Doolittle commemorates a lifetime of achievements. It has been written that General Doolittle lived one of the most useful lives in American history. I'm sure all of here will certainly agree. His achievements range from the practical to the theoretical. The general once explained his philosophy of life by saying, "I believe we were put here on earth for a purpose, to make it, within our capabilities, a better place in which to live." The world is a better place thanks to this unique individual. I am sure I speak for all of us here today, and when I say how proud the Air Force Association is to have a constant reminder in the likeness of this man of wisdom, of humor, and of warm humanity. This legend in his time and ours.
Doolittle literally had a hand in aeronautics.
Enough about the Air Force Association. I know you're all hoping President Reagan was going to call him a legend of air power. Sure he did at some point. Just lost in the bowels of film history. Okay, so strategic air power in the Pacific. First obvious major example of strategic bombing in the Pacific was on 18 April 1942 with the Doolittle raid. So kind of doing the impossible, launching E-25 bombers, Mitchell bombers, off from the USS Hornet, flying 600 miles to mainland Japan, basically targets in Tokyo and surrounding area. Now, do you think this bombing raid had any impact really on Japanese war production? No. Okay, yeah, 16 bombers against the whole industrialized country, not a significant impact. However, what was the major impact?
Morale boost for us, and morale loss for Japan.
Okay, very good. So, yes.
Japan also had to change its strategy, pull fighter jets from taking things over to defending country.
Yeah, very good. So, these 16 bomber crews, roughly 140, 150 men, kind of caused an entire nation to change its strategy, pulling some forces home to protect the mainland, as well as video kind of remarked on, can't necessarily correlate it precisely, but Japan really this may have forced Japan to kind of go more on the offensive, trying to push the U.S. back further from attacking the mainland again, kind of maybe forcing the Japanese attack at Midway, the turning point of the war. Really kind of a cool guy to read about, kind of hearing about his humbleness. He really kind of thought he was actually going to get fired almost after this raid because he had no idea what the impact was. They talked about, majority of his aircraft had to crash land. Several were captured. A couple went to the Soviet Union to land. He thought he was going to be fired, but kind of returned home hero. In very humble words too. When he's given the Medal of Honor, what did he say?
I'll spend my whole life trying to earn that.
Yeah, so pretty cool. Dedicating it to all of his troops, realizing he was just one man in the operation. Okay, so in late 1944, the South Pacific forces and the Central Pacific forces basically met up. And at that point, we basically controlled most of the Pacific Ocean. We had retaken the Philippines. The only thing we were missing was a few islands leading up to Japan, such as Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Two major battles that were fought in late 1944. Very, very bloody battles, particularly for the United States Marines. But those victories on the ground would eventually give us the airstrips we needed to attack mainland Japan and kind of really strategically bomb Japan. That's actually a good spot to stop though today. We'll finish that up next week and start moving into turn you all into Cold Warriors. I'll look over the briefing paper topics. At first glance, they all look fine. I will shoot you a note though if there's anything I see that might need a little tweaking. And then just for the cadets in here, something new we're trying to do with prospective students, like it's going to be high school scholarship season for high school seniors. Something we're trying to do is get when students come in for scholarships, maybe have somebody kind of from a hometown nearby on hand. Hey, talk to you.